So did everyone find a parking spot? Yeah. Okay. So we're now into the third one now. And we're just changing things a little bit. I was going to add on a fifth one for exercise, but I'm actually going to deal with that today because it actually fits in quite nicely. And because cognitive changes in late life and dementia is really such a huge problem, I'm going to turn the fifth one into that because I think it's very relevant. So here we are, week 3. It's a hodgepodge, isn't it? Mitochondria, centenarians, diet and exercise, and crackpots. Maybe they're all crackpots. In fact, the whole subject of aging is a bit of a crackpot industry, and we'll talk about that later. Well, I put this up because there aren't many longitudinal studies, meaning one athlete, in this case John Kelly. There are 2 statues to him on the Boston Marathon Trail. And why longitudinal studies of individuals? Because you can actually see the changes over time in one person. And it's hard to come across people who have run 20 or 30 marathons. But this is really interesting. This is the plot done by my son, actually, when he was working for me in Boston at one time. And it's very interesting because here it is. He started late. I mean, there's some people starting in their late teens these days, of course, but it is, I think he was 25 here. Most marathon times now in Boston and elsewhere are somewhere around here, just a little over 2 hours. But then these guys are running, and it was mostly guys, in leather shoes. And there wasn't the sophistication in coaching and diet and all that kind of stuff in those days. But he shows the typical learning effect. So his initial time wasn't great, 3 hours. Better than my first 2. But anyway, 3 hours, and then dropped off. And then look at it. It's more or less steady for kind of all the way up to maybe early, well, maybe mid-50s. And then you see what happens. Now, remember I've been talking about these 3 phases all along in the first lectures, the kind of the early development stage, kind of children and young adults, and with the Olympics, it was perfectly obvious that with highly sophisticated events, or at least that depended on a high degree of coordination and speed and visualization, that no one was getting gold medals past 30. And but anyway, but this is an endurance event, and so athletes tend to last longer than this. But then this, you can see the curve. A few years, maybe there were injuries here, that they couldn't run, or there was some other reason for it. But look at the steep climb after kind of mid-50s, and going right up here to his last one. And thereafter, he rode in the vehicle, and he was the fellow that waved to everyone. There were actually 2 Kellys, and John, Ed, not related, who ran the Boston Marathon, but not as many times as John did. This John. So it's a good longitudinal look. We don't, I mean, a lot of sporting who plays football on the male side past their teenage years or maybe college years? There are a lot of sports that people don't carry into later life. And then there are, I shouldn't say this too, how many golfers are there here? Okay. One of those sedentary sports. Not quite sure. You are walking the course and there's a high skill required, so I'm just kidding you. Well, what about centenarians? These are people who make it into their 90s, right? And they're called super if they get to 105 and semi-super and super centenarians, if they reach 105 and 110 respectively. It's interesting that the super centenarians, if you looked at their history, they were healthy nearly all their life. And then when they remained pretty healthy, quite healthy, and then toward the end, the last few years, 2 or 3 years down, a dive. So why? But I don't know. But it is remarkable that there does seem to be, at least at this time, a limit. Now I'm sure that in the next maybe 30 or 40 years, we'll extend that. But humans aren't going to get out to 200. They're not going to get out to 150. At least I don't think they are, without a whole new biology. And there are biological limits, as there are for almost every other species. And we talked about this last week, but just to review it, almost anything that can go wrong in a cell goes wrong in the cell with aging. And they more or less happen in parallel. I mean, there isn't one system in aging that is primarily responsible for aging. So it's a little like, I think I mentioned the analogy with the car, the various functions in a car that kind of, they all go more or less, not at the same time, but they all wear. And we would recognize that. But mutations in DNA, and that creates a lot of, despite biology's very good genetic spell check system, these mutations accumulate with time. And if they're protein encoding genes, it results in abnormal proteins. And proteins are very important. In fact, all of the neurodegenerative diseases are really diseases of proteins. So, and then I talked about epigenetic errors, meaning the DNA is okay, but the DNA, whether it's expressed or not, depends on where the bases are, which bases are methylated, and any histone modification of chromosomes. I'm not going to get back into that, but the point is, look, the first three here have something to do with DNA. Then we talked about the chromosome shortening and the effect of telomerase. We won't get into that, but look, I really put this slide together simply to show that every system, more or less, not in sync with one another, but all. We talk about the person reaching 105 or 110 or 115, and then toward the end, probably a combined system breakdown at that time. And that lady who lived the longest, 122, in France, that's what happened to her. I mean, she was eating, 2 pounds of chocolate a week and smoking all her life. And then sure, her hearing went, and her vision in the last 2 or 3 years. And then we don't know what she died of what, or whether anyone even looked. But it had that kind of terminal collapse, everything kind of going along. Now make no mistake about it. These people who are healthy 105-year-olds, they're not like us. I mean, they're slow in their movements, and cognitively they may be pretty good, but they're maybe not quite as sharp. They're certainly not as sharp as their great-great-great-grandchildren. And so, yes, they're surviving with style, and doing it for a long time, but they're not, the curve is still down, right? So, Now, what I want to talk about is errors in energy production and management. So those are mitochondria. That's very important because the brain demands a lot of energy. I think I mentioned this a week or last week. It consumes about 20% of the body's energy, and yet it weighs kind of less than 10% of the body. So it's a very energy demanding system, the brain. Well, I always like it when authors draw their own figures, and so I rather like this one. But we're talking about the mitochondria in here. It only shows 2, but there are many other, and it's really roughly drawn in all other systems I'm not going to talk about. I love this slide though, because this is really 3 cells. The blue one is the nucleus. It's been stained to look that way. And then you see all of these filaments running through the cell. Those are filaments and tubules that carry molecules around, maybe some of the high energy compounds that we're going to talk about. And also transport messages, signaling messages. But look, all of these red dots are mitochondria. And there are anywhere from 100 to thousands of them in a single cell. And they are an energy machine. They create ATP, which is the high energy compound that all biology depends on. And when did all of this start? Well, presumably, or best guess is somewhere around 2 billion years ago, Archaea adopted bacteria. This must have happened many times, but most of the time the bacteria were kind of gobbled up. But in some fortuitous instances, enough of the bacteria survived that the bacteria's energy system survived. So now the combined cell had a source of very rich high energy production. That's the key. That's when life was transformed from really simple looking cells to complex cells, which make up most of biology now, and including us. And I mentioned the numbers of those mitochondria, hundreds, even thousands. Interestingly enough, mitochondrial DNA is passed down only through the female X chromosome. The sperm don't have any mitochondria, so if there are any defects in mitochondria, they come from the maternal side. The males are blameless. This time. Mitochondria develop age-related degenerative changes, so mitochondria are kind of a universal energy source for cells. And what do I mean by that? In the pre-industrial age, this is an analogy here, energy could be obtained from the sun or burning wood or other fuels to generate heat, or from the flow of rivers to turn a mill, or from the wind to sail. But these sources of energy, the energy wasn't interchangeable. Okay? There was no common coin between the two. In today's world, all of those and other sources of energy are convertible to, guess what? Electricity. So whether it's solar energy or whatever it is converted to electricity, and then we use that electricity to drive whatever we want it to do. That's what mitochondria do. They convert energy stored in sugar by breaking them down and providing a transportable source of energy. That's adenosine triphosphate, or ATP for short. And I rather like this figure from the Encyclopedia Britannica. I haven't looked at the Encyclopedia Britannica for years, but I rather like this figure. But it shows how important, just count the numbers of ATP molecules produced. There's the membrane, sugar coming through that membrane, and the first series of chemical reactions called glycolysis, it generates 2 ATP, not bad, 2. Then it gets into the mitochondria. It goes through another series of chemical reactions and generates another 2. So now it's generated 4. But when it reaches a very specialized area in the mitochondria, it generates 32. I mean, so it's quite incredible what mitochondria can do in generating a supply of ATP. And that ATP is going everywhere, to every cell, within the cell, cells beyond. So it's really quite incredible, and I like the simplicity of that figure. Well, mitochondria, there's another thing about mitochondria. I mean, I told you that there might be several hundred to even several thousand mitochondria in a single cell. Mitochondria mutate 3 to 5 times faster than does DNA in the nucleus. This means that potentially harmful mutations, you've got 1,000 possibilities with 1,000 mitochondria in a cell, and it's 3 times or 5 times that. So the possibility of harmful mutations building up in mitochondria is much higher than it is in the nucleus with DNA. With the result that they generate fuel or energy less efficiently, which affects energy-dependent functions in the cell, such as transcription, meaning DNA to mRNA, you all know that now, and translates that mRNA into protein. Those are very high energy requiring steps. And also just getting rid of the cell's garbage is an energy demanding task. So the mitochondria should be thought of as the energy hub of the cell. Now, along the way to this complex chemistry of mitochondria is that some of the chemical compounds are unstable, especially those related to oxygen. Any atom that in its outer shell has a single electron. I mean, normally they're in pairs, but if they're a single one and they're less than what the normal number should be for that outer shell, that atom's looking for other reactive compounds that it can combine with, so it can borrow their electrons from their outer shells. You understand what I mean? That's why they're reactive compounds. They're actually looking to combine with other atoms. So that's why they call them reactive oxygen radicals. And so people have been gobbling all kinds of antioxidants, vitamin E, C, beta-carotene, and other foods rich in this, based on this premise that we're aging in part because of this oxidative phenomenon created by mitochondria. Well, we'll find out about that. But the science actually doesn't support that, despite our vitamin bottles at home, various other things. So, and here it is, an analysis of 68 randomized clinical trials of antioxidant supplements encompassing a total of 2,300 participants. That's a lot. That's a very high-powered study. Suggested that not only did those supplements not reduce mortality, but some might have increased it. Wow. That suggests that this whole idea of the free radical theory may not be correct, and that popping antioxidant supplements might not be as effective as many hope. We are a hoping species, right? We want fixes. And this stuff gets marketed like crazy, and it's not regulated by the FDA or the equivalent. So And I'll bet if we walked into any pharmacy in town, the two in town, we would find a shelf full of this stuff. And a few other things that are questionable. Well, what about this whole hypothesis about fasting and caloric restriction? We know that certain cultures, Hindus and Muslims, they mention Christians in Lent. I have yet to eat one that actually did that, but maybe I haven't. But certainly not the way Muslims do and Hindus do. So, but the point is that nearly every culture considers fasting, never mind the religion part, fasting and moderation in general a virtue. That's true. That's true. For hunter-gatherers, the other thing is we're not hunter-gatherers. It's very common to have long periods of what I call seasonal malnutrition, where food isn't as available. And so in the good times, you eat a lot because of the lean times coming, that you know are coming. And it's interesting, there's the first Homo erectus species was discovered in what is now Ukraine. And there are several of these skulls and skeletons, and it looks as if they were terribly malnourished. Might have died of starvation, how do we know? But certainly the skeletal evidence strongly suggests that. Only in the modern era has plenty become the norm. That would be speak for all of us in this town and everyone here in the West, or most people in the West. But it applies to, in the West, those who can afford it. Starvation remains all too common, as you know, and we've done a good job of creating it on a mega scale in Gaza, but East Africa as well. And so we know that. Well, let's look at the evidence on caloric restriction. I mean, a lot of this stuff, evidence, initially came with studies of mice and rats. I think I mentioned this last week. Why? Because they're cheap, easy to maintain, relatively short lifespan. So the aging process is relatively short, and but they are not us. But the early studies were done in rats and mice, and for example, it all sounds very beguiling, fed 30 to 50% fewer calories compared to those who ate as much as they liked, lived 20 to 30% longer. Okay, intuitively that makes sense to me, but better to look at a much better done study here in monkeys of dietary restriction of monkeys already on a healthy diet and not overweight to begin with. Failed to change longevity at all, so it didn't make any difference. Caloric restriction is also not without its problems. Think about Homo erectus in the extreme. Slow wound healing, loss of muscle mass, reduction in libido, starvation impairs responses to infection, and in the case of the young, can impair brain development. That's a very, Bill Gates is the Gates Foundation is very involved in this because of the realization that starvation, in the early years of life, really has serious consequences for all of life, because that's the time when the brain is developing and the cells are all going to their assigned destinations and forming connections, genetically determined connections. And if they don't do it because of not enough if they don't have the nutritive support to actually do that, then they're in trouble. So Gates is right to point that out, that it isn't just the adults, people like us and middle life. It's the most vulnerable are babies and children. Yes?
In the study of the monkeys,
Yeah.
was that done in the wild or in captivity?
No, captivity.
Okay.
Where else could you control?
Well, I was thinking that
Come down. From that tree, damn it. Yeah, so, well, here's another one of those consensus reports. I'm not always a fan of consensus reports, but here it is, for what it's worth. This is a large group of gerontologists. I'm not sure what they thought of that first sentence. Eliminating all age-related causes of death would not increase the expectancy by more than 15 years. That's a lot. And yeah, I wouldn't mind 15 additional years. So that's kind of one of those crazy statements. But there's no solid evidence that antioxidants, and they have already mentioned that. I also mentioned last week, spent about 10 minutes on telomere shortening. There's no evidence that plays a role in humans, might in mice, or rats, but not us. Caloric restriction, that's an interesting one, has not been shown to prolong the life of humans. I would just point out another thing. Caloric restriction, Elizabeth would be aware of this, but in intensive care units, when people go in, I mean, they've obviously got something very serious or they wouldn't be in there. But I can tell you they lose muscle like crazy, almost beginning in the first day or so. And that's happening to other systems as well. So you better have a very good reason for being in there, and because people lose a lot of function, which is very hard to regain. And people have been in an ICU for kind of several weeks. Rehab is going to be a real challenge. They may not get back to work, right? Regardless of what the problem is. So that's something to be careful of, and they also are consuming energy like crazy. They're probably consuming 2 to 3 times what we would be doing. So even though they're being fed seemingly adequately, it might not be up to the demand. Yes.
Is that all age groups or just the elderly?
Oh, no, I wasn't focusing on the elderly here. I was making a general statement. That applies to young people as well. But they're not as vulnerable as younger folks. They start out at a better mark, so to speak. But you're right. Okay. And that happened a lot in COVID. Remember, they were getting into ICUs and then these devastating long periods of many months or a year or two or beyond that and never got back to where they were. Now, part of that was obviously COVID. Part of it was being in the ICU, which saved them.
Lack of movement,
Yeah.
lack of skeletal movement, the skeletal muscle
Yeah.
atrophy.
Now here's one of these things. This is a drug. Well, we'll get into this. There are enzymes. One in particular called TOR. It's one of a family of enzymes that kind of switch the machine on to create new proteins or shut it down. And so with caloric restriction, the response of this enzyme is to switch off protein production and growth pathways and green light this autophagy, which means getting rid of sick cells. And it increases longevity. It's kind of one of those weird things that's not so intuitive to me. So one of the things was, well, is there a drug around that might have the same properties as that particular enzyme without the same requirement for caloric restriction? Well, there is, and that's the drug, rapamycin. And it mimics the effects of caloric restriction. And on the side, in laboratories, if you find that the scientists are taking a drug on the side, nice to have that. Was the slide that good? Yeah. So some of the scientists were taking this stuff on the side. Now they would have access to it in the lab. And I might say this included the Nobel Prize winner of the book I was referring to earlier. So he fessed up that at the age of 70 he was taking this drug. I mean, no harm. Now I want to get into the exercise stuff because it may seem odd. I mean, I don't. But my background, I mean, I'm a clinical neurologist and a neuroscientist, but for the last several years that I was in London, Ontario, I was associated with the Center for Activity and Aging. So I got into the whole business of aging, and it was actually quite a good scientific group. And then I hit the real gem, which was the USDA in Boston, Massachusetts, associated with Tufts. That's the United States Department of Agriculture, but has a great big interest in. They're the one, you know, the food stacks that they kind of revise what you should be eating all the time. That's where it comes from. But they had a really remarkable person there, Miriam Nelson. I'll say a little bit more about Miriam, but Miriam, she wrote 3 or 10 books that start out as Strong Women and then something else after that. 5 of them were on the New York Times best-selling list. And she was on the presidential committee or foundation, whatever it was, in Washington. I don't know which president appointed her, and then she became the head of that group. So she knows what she's doing. She also did an interesting little study with several other people at Tufts, and it was, can you take people like us, or maybe not us, but other people, maybe at a younger age, but aren't used to exercise, and can you train them to run the Boston Marathon with the proper training, with all the tools that we have? And this meant kind of getting together with a Tufts track coach, lead coach, Miriam, and several other experts, and they assessed all of these people really very carefully, and they were stepped up in their activity. Now these are people almost sedentary. They all finished the Boston Marathon. Did they break the 3-hour mark? No. But they finished, and they finished safely. And that shows you what you can achieve, I think, when it's done properly. And that was a kind of a creature of Miriam. So really quite a nice, quite a person. And her husband is a musician with the Boston Symphony, and she's a big athlete herself. And I remember the USDA had 12 floors. She never took an elevator. She always ran, not walked, ran up the stairs everywhere. It didn't look like that. I mean, she wasn't pudgy or anything like that, but she was really extraordinarily fit. And these are some other people that I worked with over those years, and there were others as well, doctoral students and postdoc students. So I owe a lot to them. So what I'm beginning to say here comes from those groups in different places. Well, what about the age-related neuromuscular changes? And I've already mentioned some of these, but when you lose motor nerve cells in the spinal cord, in the brainstem or the neocortex, people develop weakness. And if it happens to involve the spinal cord or the brainstem, wasting. The muscles will actually waste. So that's what happens with ALS. Okay. If you lose sensory nerve cells, and it involves sensation from the limbs and or the vestibular system, coordination's impaired. So is balance. And And of course, if you lose muscle mass for whatever reason, that also leads to weakness. And osteopenia, you all know about that. And the males in the room should be aware by now that they're at risk too. Not as much risk as females, but they are at risk. And for decades, people didn't recognize that males actually develop risky osteopenia. So that's pretty simple stuff. These are the benefits of physical activity. I mean, all of this you know: increased strength and mobility and flexibility, balance, increased bone density, reduction in risk of fractures, the cardiovascular system, reduction in hypertension, better function of the heart, reduced risk of stroke, and upregulation of the immune system, which is a good thing. More stamina. These are all the feel-good kind of stuff, but they're real things. They're real progress. Now, what Miriam and her group did, what's in her group? It was a very remarkable thing because the science of this is really solid. Harvard, Tufts University, and Boston University cooperated on the largest exercise study ever done, not been replicated. That's where Miriam Nelson's books came out of. And the idea, they focused on women. The first studies concentrated on women because they thought they were the most vulnerable. And they looked at women from their 20s to 100. And they designed an exercise program that didn't require you to go to a gym. It had to be a fairly simple program that you could do at home. It didn't require you to go anywhere. And then they monitored, and they trained. And it was amazing, the results. I mean, women in their 90s increased their kind of strength by 20 to 50%, depending on kind of the muscle group. Amazing. This with just tools in the home. And so it was a very, very well done study by three very good institutions. And it was pretty obvious. When they did CT scans or MRI scans, you could see that muscle bulk increase, pretty obvious, as well as the force generated by those muscles. So very real stuff. What they were targeting, at least in older people, the high risk of falls, fractures. That's what they were after. So that would be this group. And and did a great job of it. So the principles of this thing, the initial assessment, medical assessment, and continuing medical assessment. There's just a few things. You can read that while I talk. But you know, one of the things is you have, in principle, the best training program is one that engages as many muscle groups as possible at the same time. Now, the ideal in that is cross-country skiing. Well, we're not about to do that. But you get the idea that the trunk muscles are involved, the upper limbs are involved, the lower limbs are involved. It doesn't get much better. Swimming to some extent, but you also have to do it with enough effort. I mean, I watch dog watchers around this town. How many of you have dogs? And I see them kind of walking slowly. There is a benefit to that, but you actually have to walk briskly if you want a benefit from it. There is a beauty in walking outside. Why? Because it isn't. The ground is a little uneven, so it forces you to adjust, helps your balance. That's a freebie of walking outside. And what are we talking about, and how much a week? You know, we can debate that, but certainly at least say 30 minutes, minimum of 3 times a week, about up to 5 times a week. Now that's a half an hour investment. And when I first came to this town, so that's 22 years ago, I remember there were fairly large groups because I would see them in the dark in the winter, walking along with their poles, right?
Yeah.
And so that, what was that doing? Well, it's also a cultural group. It's friends, it's actually conversation going on, but they're also exercising. So they're exercising this, and their muscle group. It's a great thing to do, social thing to do, as well as a muscle thing. So that's a very good thing. Golf, you know, if you're walking a 9-hole course or 18-hole course and not in a little buggy, if you're actually walking and carrying your clubs, that's really good. And so I'm not knocking golf, but and train intensively. Now, oh, here's what I wanted to say. Muscle contains, it's divided up into units. Each of those units is controlled by a single motor nerve cell. If you make a weak contraction, just a very weak contraction, you recruit motor units that are small and are very fatigue resistant. So you can keep walking for almost miles with those units, but they don't generate a lot of force. So I often, when I look at people walking, when I look at them, I think, okay, how much of their muscle are they actually training? Because if you think of these motor units, some of them are small and fatigue resistant, and there are a lot of them, and there are fewer of the ones that generate a lot of force, but fatigue. And they have a higher threshold for activating. Are you following where I'm going with this? Does your exercise program ever actually train? Are too many of the motor unit teams sitting on the bench never trained by what you're doing because there's not enough intensity in what you're doing? Follow what I'm saying? So one of the little principles here that you can work out, and the group in Boston did, is use a maximum voluntary contraction. If you make a maximum effort, say a contraction of your bicep, what you can do with one contraction, just one, whatever that is, you know, say it's 10 pounds or 10 kilograms, I don't know what it is, but then you train at 20 to 30% of that. And you stand a very good chance, periodically, of recruiting almost all of the motor units in the muscle. So there aren't any ones left on the bench sometimes. So those principles are very important to incorporate in a training program, okay, if you're looking for a benefit. That's what I'm getting at here. Hydration is, I don't know about other animals, but I don't think humans have a very good sense for whether they're dehydrated or not. And that could be a big problem. It was for me when I started to do a lot of bicycling, and especially in weather like this or warmer. I had no sense that I was getting so severely dehydrated, and except losing sometimes after 2 hours or something like that. And that can be very harmful because we don't have cues. It wasn't a little biological alert flag going off with me or with others. Well, oh, listen, write this down on the bit. What of it? On YouTube. I put it on the slide last night. Yeah, that's what, you better take a picture of it if you've got a camera here. That strong women and men live well, nutrition and exercise for optimal health. That's Miriam. She's terrific. You believe everything she says. But it's also well-founded. And she's very clear about the stuff. So take a picture of that. That's a good thing. If you do that, then that's fine. Well, what about brain training? Well, is there a relationship between the two? Of course there is. Physical training involves brain training. In fact, my last PhD student in Boston, that was his study. to differentiate between the brain side of it and the muscle side of it. And of course you know, let's say you take up skiing for the first time. You've never skied on a slope before. You fall down once or twice initially, but you know, you're really awkward, but you know, by an hour, you might be tired by this time, but you're at least standing up and making a few awkward kind of turns. And by the end of the day, you're on the, you know, the baby hill. That's all your brain. The muscle's doing nothing. In fact, you're probably tired and fatigued. The muscle change takes place over several weeks. The brain training starts at zero, time zero, and that's what happens in music lessons. Almost anything that you learn, it's kind of new. You may be a little klutzy and don't do it so well initially, but you pick it up, and that's most of that is your brain before your muscle stuff, and then is it any surprise that when you're learning to do something, the brain isn't sure of how this is all going to turn out, so it tends to recruit neurons in various scattered regions of the neocortex that might be related to whatever you're doing. It's no surprise that as your movements become more skilled, that the neurons activated are far more selective, right? So it's refining in neural activity within your brain and your spinal cord. That's actually what's happening. And sometimes, for example, with very repetitive activity, violinists, for example, piano players, they actually develop enlargement of the related areas of the neocortex. Doesn't mean they've got more nerve cells, but they probably have more connections and more robust connections for that particular activity. Okay? And now, here's a little, so one of the things that in the group that I was associated with in Boston and London and then at McMaster, and we were overlapping membership in the group, but we were very interested, okay, that's what happens in the whole muscle as a whole or a muscle group, but what's actually happening at a single nerve cell unit level? And some of the results were really studied, just to show you what one unit looks like. There's same scale, same magnification for the muscle and the spinal cord here. This happens to be a cat. That's how tiny one motor neuron is. Every white spot in here is a muscle fiber supplied by that one nerve. Isn't that incredible? So this is a single parent family, and there are hundreds of children. How'd you like to look after that? Okay. So that's a motor unit. So that's actually what we're looking at, and what we looked at were muscles in the hand. It may sound like a crazy kind of thing to do this, but you know, you have 6 extraocular muscles per eye. There are approximately 800 to 1,000 nerve cells per muscle. That's a lot of neural resources committed to keeping your gaze conjugate. So you only see one image, right? Versus your whole gastric medius muscle. The whole muscle is well less than 1,000 motor neurons for a big muscle. The hand muscles, from an evolutionary point of view, they're right up there, the precision grip. They are the most, and an enormous area in the neocortex is really committed to the lips, the oral muscles for speech, tongue, the thumb, no surprise, and the index finger, because Homo, at least us and our cousins, were probably the first to develop that movement. And So these in my thumb muscle are 5 separate muscles, believe it or not. And there are another 4 in the forearm that control my thumb. So there are probably, just to do this, there are several thousand motor nerve cells doing that, or doing tapping like that. Isn't that incredible? And it's reflected in the relatively large space or area in the neocortex committed to that, and that map was drawn by Penfield many years ago, refined by others, but initially done by Penfield. So it's actually incredibly easy to stimulate, to find and stimulate the same nerve fiber, and therefore its motor unit, with a surface stimulus. And you might find them anywhere along the nerve all the way up into the axilla. The interesting thing is you can go back the same time, the next day, next month, 6 months from now, a year from now, 10 years from now, and find the same unit. And it will have the same electrical signature and the same force signature until it starts to age. So you're actually looking at single cells. You can also train them independent of any volition, simply by stimulating that single nerve fiber and no others, and measuring the force it generates, and looking at its electrical signal. And there it is. Well, there's the setup. That's actually a drawing of me in this thing, and the force recording from the thumb. And there are 2 units here. There's one here that is primarily a flexion one. It's kind of doing this, and another one which is an abduction one. It's kind of rolling the thumb. So those are 2 units. Here's the one that really gets to me, because no strength study has ever shown anything like this in the whole muscle or a group of muscles. Training a single motor nerve fiber, a single motor unit, doesn't always get you a stronger motor unit. In fact, it clearly doesn't, because on this side, here's one particular unit called W1 here. This is at 0 time, and during the training, it actually got weaker. Over the 11 weeks of the training. And then, when they stopped the training, it recovered. Now, what's interesting too, well, there's several lessons here, is that training this way shows you that there's a training effect within a week. But you also lose it, begin to lose it within a week. Okay, you don't retain it. So this effect that was created here, an adverse effect, I would say a negative force, generating less force, almost immediately when the training program was stopped, then that motor unit started to recover. And the same happened with a more normal response over here. Here's another unit starting out at day 0, and over a 7-week training program, the force of the unit generated by the unit went up, and almost immediately, within a day or 2 of stopping the training, the person's losing the effect of the training. That's the reason for keeping up your training. There are no holidays with training. That's the point I'm trying to make here. All right. So, but also that the type of training influences what actually happens. And in one case, it was an adverse one. I mean, who wants to lose force? I think. So there we have it. How are we on time? Oh, almost. Well, here's the thing, the summary right here. How exercise benefits your cells and overall health. Brisk, well, their recommendation, the group here, this is in Nature, so a very good source. Brisk walking for 450 minutes each week. You know, that's 7 hours. That's 7 hours. Is associated with living 4.5 years longer. Not bad as a dividend. And that physical activity often damages the muscle, meaning some of the muscle fibers break down, but they also recover, they regenerate. So you're not losing. And it also burns up excess energy that would otherwise be stored as fat, which we don't want, especially the retroperitoneal fat, the brown fat, the not good fat. And exercise also wraps up the immune system. That's a very good thing. So, well, I'm just going to take, I love this. I have to read this one. Enthusiastic tech billionaires are mostly middle-aged men, sometimes married to younger women. Well, I think we know who we're talking about. Who made their money very young, enjoy their lifestyles, and don't want poverty to end. When they were young, they wanted to be rich, and now that they are rich, they want to be young. But youth is the one thing they cannot instantly buy. And so, not surprisingly, they've expressed an interest in anti-aging research. I didn't read any of their names, did I? They believe aging is just another engineering problem to be solved by hacking the code of life. They are used to making major breakthroughs in a couple of years, sometimes a few months. Currently, many of these same people prematurely unleashed, remember a year ago? AI on the world, while at the same time warning us of its dangers. And they did. All of them, with one notable exception, Bill Gates. And so I thought he got a really good handle on the industry here. That was very good. And I think, oh, we don't need that. Oh, just last thing to close on this. You know, this is a series on aging, but of course we've been talking about disease as well. But I think there's a continuum of the two. Many of the diseases we talk about are really products of aging in some form. I mean, after all, mutations develop or accumulate, and we label as a product, we label kind of 20 years after that as a disease. That's still an aging thing. Yes, it's a disease because it manifests with certain features that we're used to calling a disease. But I think there's a continuum between the two. And we see this when we get to if you want to come to that one on dementia, because it stands out as the major lesson there is that almost all these neurodegenerative diseases and many other diseases have a long run-on before they become clinically obvious for what's happening. So I might have several things that I don't know about right now. And any assay will miss it. And it's only when it crosses a certain threshold for detection that we know about it, right? That's a very important thing, because if we're talking about prevention, then the time to be doing something about it is much earlier, I think. That's the lesson. It isn't just Alzheimer's disease. Like I say, it applies to cardiovascular disease. I mean, yes, the risk of a stroke is related to arrhythmias, to all other kind of risk factors, and it's a kind of cumulative effect. But that train was getting into trouble over 10, 20, 30 years. Those atheroma plaques did not spring up overnight. They've been there for a long, long time. And some of it, people, because they, for example, thinking about people with angina, if people reduce their activity level, the intensity of their activity level, they might not know it, because they're not doing enough to produce symptomatic ischemia. That happened to my father-in-law, for sure, and it was missed for 2 or 3 years, and partly because he didn't fess up to it too. Only in retrospect, after he had a stroke, did he kind of admit that, yes, he had, for several years, with a brisk walk, he would get this pain. Well, clearly, it might have been an embolus from an infarcted area in his heart. So anyway, so next week, we're going to move on. Next week's kind of fun. This is kind of the drug stuff. But next week is going to be fun because we're making organs next week. And hybrid systems. And it sounds crazy. I can tell you that people are working on it. And so that's a good thing. And then we'll do the dementia one. And that's it. So yes.
How would you rank active swimming versus active walking as beneficial to your muscles?
You know, I don't know, and I don't know that a comparison. I'm sure Miriam Nelson has the answer for you right now. Or Tim Doherty, one of my doc students, would have an answer for you. It's the intensity, isn't it?
Yes,
for
but it
both.
takes the weight off.
Yeah,
If
it
you're swimming,
takes
you
the
don't
weight.
have to worry about the weight.
Except, one of the best ways to build resistance is to walk in water. You try
Yes,
that one,
yes,
with
yes,
water
yes.
up to your waist,
And the
and try to keep up a
elliptical.
pace. It's a lot more resistance than walking through air,
Yes.
right? So that's a good thing, but I take your point. I used to watch the Aquafit group,
Yes,
while it was
yes.
still open.
We were there.
And I always well, my take on that of watching it, because Dan was part of it, was that there wasn't enough resistance to what they were doing to actually do much. But what was really good was the social part.
Yes.
And why not that? Yeah, that's important. So anything else? Yeah.
I'm just curious, after I had one of the surgeries on my knee, when I was sitting down, I couldn't find the muscles to lift my leg up straight. Was that cellular level? Like they kept on telling me to picture lifting your leg and you'll be able to do it.
Yeah.
Was that realistic?
No. Yeah. It could be passively grown.
Yes.
Yeah, but you couldn't voluntarily grow. And there wasn't any discomfort associated with it.
So brain disconnect with the leg muscles?
Well, joint replacement, remember some of the sensory knowledge of joint angle and torque on the thing comes from the joint capsule, and even a little bit of within the joint. Interestingly enough, though, after millions of hip replacements that have been done, there's never been any loss of position sense.
Position sense for the
Yeah.
knees.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but the knee is different. Yeah, the knee is different, and that's a problem, isn't it? Because if you don't know where your limit is, then it's hard to safely step downstairs.
You need proprioception with the hip.
Yeah, proprioception.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, there's a lot of proprioception coming from the muscles and the tendons, not necessarily the joint capsule. And there aren't many receptors in the joint itself, the way people initially thought. But there's certainly, people can lose, there's some element of loss of position sense and speed of movement that is lost with joint replacements. And it also depends on the surgical procedure itself, how minimalist it is. I mean, if you take the whole acetabulum out and you replace that, and so you have an artificial joint sitting in an artificial socket, that's a lot of proprioceptive information or sensory information that's been lost.
They don't have to do that so much anymore.
No,
They've improved.
yeah, it's getting better, yeah. But better would be not to have the fracture. And you know, my sister, the trouble with this stuff can happen. My sister was very, very active, socially and just getting around out in DC. And for some reason, she climbed a ladder, I think, to fix something. Fell off and fractured her hip. And then died of, I think, a pulmonary embolus 6 or 8 weeks later. But she had a lot of trouble in that initial period with the rehab and kind of figuring out. And she was a high-level nurse with a lot of real experience in healthcare, and she couldn't figure out why she couldn't do certain things. And so I don't know how that would have turned out if she hadn't had the pulmonary embolus. My own suspicion with Sally, knowing her, I think that she did not want to go to the hospital if something like that happened. And I suspect she knew exactly what happened. I mean, it's such a dramatic thing that she probably had a good guess at that, and then it was confirmed later. But anyway, any other thing? Anything else? No? Okay. All right, so we're back next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.